Good morning. Welcome to the Miller Center and the Democratic Statecraft Lab at the University of Virginia. I'm Todd Sexer, professor of politics here at UVA, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Miller Center and the director of the Statecraft Lab. One of our goals here at the Statecraft Lab is to help bridge the gap between scholars who are engaged in cutting-edge research about international affairs and you, the broader public. And today is the latest in our series of events discussing important academic books about US foreign policy and international politics. Today, the topic of our discussion is a groundbreaking book about a problem of critical importance to US foreign policy today, and that is the crisis facing the liberal international order. For many decades, the United States has played an indispensable role in building international institutions, confronting global threats, expanding free trade, and upholding the rule of law around the world. But today, both American leadership and the state of liberal democracy in international affairs are increasingly in doubt. Around the world, democratic safeguards are being eroded, authoritarian populism is on the rise, and an era of great power competition has returned. Democracies today face growing challenges from non-democratic nations who claim to offer alternatives to liberal democratic governance. Our book today takes stock of this situation, tracing the rich history of the liberal international project. It asks whether democracy around the world is even still worth defending today, and how it can be protected from the wide range of threats facing it. The book is titled A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crises of Global Order. And we are fortunate to have with us today its author, Dr. John Ikenberry, who is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. To lead the conversation with Dr. Ikenberry, today we have with us John Owen, who is the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics here at UVA, as well as a senior fellow at the Miller Center and a member of the Statecraft Lab. Dr. Owen is also the author of 3 important books on democracy, culture, and liberalism in international relations. I hope you enjoy the conversation. And John Owen, I turn it over to you.
Good, thank you, Todd. Thanks to our audience, a warm welcome to you. Before I forget, let me encourage you in the audience to ask questions of Professor Ikenberry. At any point during the session, you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and those questions will be curated for us. We will present those to Professor Ikenberry as the session goes on. And I want to thank John Ikenberry for joining us to talk about his book, A World Safe for Democracy. This is my copy. In addition, Todd said who John is. He's professor at Princeton. He is also author not just of this book, but of a number of books, editor of other books, author of many key articles in our field of the study of international relations. And among his books are After Victory and Liberal Leviathan before this. And I have been following, I've read, I think, everything John Ikenberry has written and have followed it. It's been enormously influential to me in my career, and I'm far from alone in that. I think it's fair to say he is our field's premier scholar of what is generally called liberal internationalism, or the liberal international order. I've noticed that politicians have taken to calling it the rules-based international order. I think that's roughly the same thing, though John Ikenberry may differ on that. It's generally acknowledged that this order, whatever we call it, is in jeopardy at this point in history. In the immediate sense, the world is looking at a Russia that seems poised to invade its smaller neighbor, Ukraine. And hence, even if it doesn't end up invading, it's challenging a number of features of the liberal international order. So, John Ikenberry, this book is a bit different from your past work on liberal internationalism. I want to talk about that. Before we get into that, I wonder if I could just turn it over to you to convey some of the main points of the book, just a short précis, if you would.
Thank you, John. First of all, just appreciate your own work in this area. So I could very much turn the table and ask you questions, because you are as much an authority as I am in this broad area. This book was really written, began kindly from an invitation from UVA to give a set of lectures. They were in November of 2016, right after the election. I must say the audience was somewhat subdued. We had just been through what I think most people would say an historic election, and there was a sense of reflection, a kind of autumn gray sense that the liberal international era may be, if not coming to an end, now in a kind of moment of decline that requires us to reflect back. And what I wanted to do in those lectures and in this book is to really do three things. Number one, to in this period of crisis, look back and try to make the case that liberal internationalism has a certain kind of standing in the world, a kind of intellectual gravitas that can give it some grist in the struggles that we are in the political world and in the intellectual world. In the intellectual world with realism and other world ideologies, but to try to reconstruct what the tradition is. And that's why the book is in some sense about ideas and their lineages, their genealogy, and how they've come from the 19th into the 20th century and into our century. The book also tries to be honest about accomplishments and failures. I must say that in the 90s, there was a great deal of celebration, but with the Iraq War and with the 2008 financial crisis, there's been a lot of critique, not just by those on the outside, but by liberals themselves, including my own critique of American foreign policy at various moments, but whether it's Bush foreign policy in Iraq or Trump, but to both make the case for liberal internationalism, but to acknowledge its failures, its shortcomings, its blind spots, and then thirdly to look ahead, to look at the horizon and try to imagine what liberal internationalism, which we'll get into here, but which is in many ways an ongoing effort at cooperative organization of the international order led by liberal democracies to create a kind of environment or a milieu to allow these what I think are really increasingly seen as fragile societies, liberal democracies, to protect themselves and to navigate the dangers and the storms of 21st century modernity.
Well, I want to say, we need to cut to the chase and talk about this thing, liberal internationalism. What is it? I want to say, though, just to the audience, this book really is a tour de force. It really is the first full treatment, as far as I know, of liberal internationalism and all of its aspects across 2 centuries of history. And it really crosses disciplinary boundaries. It has some political theory, some political history, some intellectual history, economic history, lots of political science, of course, in it. And so John Ikenberry examines and narrates efforts by liberals and liberal democracies, governments, over 2 centuries to transform, rationalize various aspects of international politics in areas such as international law, dispute resolution, peace, trade, and other economic relations. And the book, notes that in the 19th century, these efforts were mostly scattered and diffuse, I think it's fair to say. In the early 20th century, Woodrow Wilson cobbled together these efforts into modern liberal internationalism, although even that has evolved over the ensuing decades. It's really been a century or more since Wilson did his thing in the 1910s. As John Ikenberry writes, liberal internationalism can be understood as a tradition of order building that emerged with the rise and spread of liberal states, and its ideas and agendas have been shaped and reshaped as these countries have grappled with the great forces of modernity. So maybe one way to get into this, John, is to talk about that last bit about modernity, that liberal internationalism is at bottom, according to your argument, a grappling with modernity. So that sounds like a big abstract claim. Can you say more about that? What do you mean by modernity? Why does it need grappling with? And how has liberal internationalism, in fact, been that grappling?
Yes, that's a great first question to get started. That term is a big, complex term, much debated, but it in essence is signaling a kind of historical boundedness to the liberal project, that the liberal democracies emerged in what we call the modern era, which is itself a kind of a period, whether you want to date it to the 16th and 17th century, the revolutions and transformations of society, showing a break, if you will, between traditional and the classical eras of society, and this kind of modern era. Modern society was being born on the heels of scientific and technological advancements and revolutions, trade, urbanization, exploration, innovation, and ideas that were emerging from the discourses of the Enlightenment, heralding a kind of sense that things are not what they used to be, that something called modern society is emerging, and within that, the age of democratic revolutions in the 18th and 19th century. That's really where I think liberal internationalism begins to emerge. The rise of a new kind of society. We call it liberal society, with markers that we can identify and use to distinguish liberal society, from other polities and political formations out there at the same time in this early beginning period and in earlier historical eras. A limited, divided government, rule of law, separation of church and state, civil society beyond the reach of a predatory state, civic rights enshrined in the Constitution. These features of modern liberal society were emerging, and the term modernity captures that. And in many ways, what I'm suggesting is that without the rise of liberal democracy, which itself is an artifact of these deeper revolutions and transformations that we call modernity, liberal internationalism would not really have a role. Without liberal democracies, you wouldn't be talking about liberal internationalism. So in that sense, it's helpful in a couple ways. It distinguishes liberal internationalism from its great intellectual rival, realism, which has much more of a unbounded scope for where the ideas fit, wherever there is anarchy. But it also, secondly, helps cue in our understanding of liberal internationalism as a kind of evolutionary, as a problem-solving set of ideas and projects that are there because modernity is generating problems and opportunities that we associate with rising interdependence, more complex societies, and these fragile liberal democracies that need to have a kind of safe, protected environment for their operation. So I think it's not while the term modernity is kind of large and grandiose in many ways, I think it does help us understand how and why these societies emerge and what the specific set of recurrent problems are that they focus on.
Good. Well, I wonder if you could get more specific about this, kind of drill down a bit. Talk about one of the big problems that modernity threw at liberal democracies and how they used or built liberal internationalism to address this. And I mean, I can think of a few, major World War I and World War II. These technologically driven wars were so massively destructive. Another, the Great Depression, sandwiched between those two world wars. Take your pick. Is there what would help illustrate what this means? Modernity throws a problem at liberal democracies, and they use liberal internationalism to try to address it, and also sometimes had success. Right? Maybe you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, I would actually start in the 19th century. Liberal internationalism really begins with the rise of internationalism. So think about the rise of liberal democracies in the 19th century, which are expressions of nation states, the rise of political entities that are not simply monarchical or autocratic, but have a society attached to the state that are part of that are in that sense they are kind of markers of the emergence of nationalism, of nation states. And so with that rise of these new entities, you get a kind of internationalism that goes with it. Nationalism and internationalism are kind of Siamese twins, and you get all this activity that looks like it's problem solving and functional in various sorts. Trade agreements, starting with the abolition of the Corn Laws. You get the peace movement because you have these societies growing in their military capabilities, and war itself becomes a kind of order of magnitude greater as a problem. And then again, it does it in the 20th century several times more. The parliamentary assemblies, the emergence of solidarity among democracies, each working on similar sorts of problems, looking to learn from each other, the rise of jurists and international law, and of course capitalists and bankers, and the need for more articulated and sophisticated forms of international order to allow these dynamic societies, which are sort of oriented towards the international system. They're oriented towards trade and exchange and cooperation to have a kind of working space for them to deal with both opportunities and dangers. So it's both of those things that are driving internationalism. And then with Woodrow Wilson in the 20th century, liberal internationalism becomes more of a political project. Obviously, as you suggest, the two world wars are incredible moments of revelation in the nature of modernity and the problems that humanity faces, and it becomes a catalyst for the liberal reimagination of the global system. And Wilson's era and generation did it, and of course, even more so, I would argue, the FDR generation saw modernity in new ways, and in terms of the changing nature of interaction, interdependence, threats, opportunities. And so in each instance, you see this kind of efforts at reimagining political space and the way that liberal democracies and other fellow traveler states operate in this system. So there's an economic component, there's a security component, there's a kind of human rights and changing nature of legitimacy component. So it evolves. It has different. There's no kind of one set of ideas. You have classical liberals on the one hand and social democrats on the other. Liberal internationalism gets affiliated with empire in the British period and into the 20th century. And it gets very much tied to anti-imperial movements and causes. It becomes a kind of template for a kind of small, the West versus the rest, a kind of a more inclusive kind of notion of the liberal world order. And in other moments, in the hands of other thinkers, it becomes a universal project where everyone is implicated in this evolving system. So it has so many different features, and part of the story is the debate, not just between liberals and their critics, but within the liberal tradition, debates about what are the problems and how do we secure our values and institutions in this rapidly evolving global system.
Very helpful. It's a capacious phenomenon. Right? Liberal internationalism contains a lot, contains worlds, and it contains some tensions that you alluded to, and maybe we could talk about that. In fact, let's launch into one possible tension, but possible. I want you to talk about whether this is a feature or a bug, and it's hegemony. So you are, in addition to being a scholar of liberal internationalism, you're a scholar of hegemony, liberal hegemony specifically. And I would say, to flatter you one more time, and then I want more. I really think you're the best, deepest thinker we have on liberal hegemony, how it works. And there's some competition out there, but I think your work is just remarkable in that regard. And so I want to take advantage of this time and get you to talk about hegemony. That is to say, for the viewers, international power or leadership or having, and this cashes out as follows. In the 19th century, most scholars would say that liberal internationalism had a national leader with a lot of power. It was Great Britain. Mm-hmm. In the 20th century, we've already alluded to Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, just happened to be U.S. presidents at the end of world wars that the United States won or helped win. So they had, as you've written, the United States had massive international power at the end of both of those wars, especially the Second World War. So clearly, power of the sort that realists are concerned about is part of this story. So how do you tell us how you weave that in? And there does seem to be a tension.
There's a tension.
Yeah.
Well, I have two things to say about that of a very broad character, but I want to pick up on your term capacious, because liberal internationalism is capacious, as you say, but it's paradoxically also thin in the sense that it's a set of ideas, a kind of worldview with all of its different variations, but it's not something that itself provides an ordering program for the world. That is to say, it's a flag without an army. I've never seen anybody really marching in the streets for more liberal internationalism in the sense that of a kind of broad ideology of organizing the world. It's always in need of allies and partners. It's always, and you could even argue, and I sort of mentioned this in the book, it needs a host to light upon. It needs to be tied to other projects, people doing other things for other purposes, including, and that's what I'm getting to, great power politics and Anglo-American hegemony. But more broadly, and this is how I struggle with the idea that for all the you might say idealism, the vision of a better world that liberalism holds up, elevating the condition of humanity, as Abraham Lincoln put the liberal project in his terms, in his day, for all that aspiration for betterment, it has always found itself entangled in other things. across 200 years, empire and imperialism, great power politics, capitalism of various sorts, and of course, these Anglo-American eras of domination. And it's been, if you might say, from the perspective of the ideas and the projects of liberal internationalism, it's good news and bad news. You're tying yourself, take the Cold War, to other order building projects, to other impulses, bipolar balancing. You are in a coalition with realists who see liberal internationalism as a means and not an end, while you're pursuing the same policies, seeing it as an end and not a means. So you have all these different entanglements and coalitions that in some sense sully the pristine version of the ideas. So that would be one of the ways that you would try to show how, in particular, hegemony fits with liberal internationalism. On balance, I think hegemony, the fact that you had the dominant state in the 19th century in terms of capitalism and geopolitics, embracing, at least in part, liberal ideas, even if it had an empire, and the United States in the 20th century doing the same thing, I think even more so. The world has more liberal internationalism in it because of those hegemonic projects that, as I said, are partly driven by other motivations. So that's a point I would say, that liberal internationalism needs these kind of broader forces to push it forward, even as they sometimes compromise its ideals. The other thing I would say is that, and this is kind of a surprise that I would not have figured out if I had not kind of gone through the stories and the sequences and the eras of liberal internationalism, and that is that these great geopolitical rivalries, the First World War with autocratic Germany, during World War II with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and then with the Cold War, Soviet communism. In each of these cases, a liberal hegemon, the US, is facing a less liberal state. And in that antagonism, violent war in two cases, a Cold War in the other, there is a kind of catalytic effect on the liberal imagination. The war itself is mobilizing the liberal state to do more, number one. And number two, there's a kind of ideological rivalry. Think of Wilson versus Lenin. Think of FDR versus the Nazi New Order. And of course, much more well-known, the US-Soviet ideological conflict. In each case, there was kind of a feedback effect on liberal society, sometimes strengthening the state that might be not welcomed by classical liberals, but in other ways, fortifying the project of building a more liberal, open, progressive society. The civil rights movement was conducted in America on a global stage, where doing better and more fully realizing the promissory notes of liberal society were given more impetus because, again, the world was watching. There were alternatives. Another society, the Soviet Union, was making the argument that they were the vanguard of modernity. So in each of these cases, the geopolitical conflict was always with a less liberal society, and that the friction of that geopolitical conflict had not simply a negative impact. In some ways it did, but it had, I would say, more profoundly in each of these instances a progressive impact, expanding the franchise after World War I, and of course the social democratic revolutions of the 40s and 50s and 60s and onward. And the one global struggle that didn't do that was 9/11. The war on terror, on balance, did not have that catalytic effect. And I'll just leave it out there. It's an open question whether the coming US-China great power rivalry will see the U.S. return to some of those catalytic dynamics that made the U.S. in a very competitive ideological environment come back to its own values, to see what it can do to make them more secure and advance them again on a global stage of competition.
Yeah, and we could add civil rights struggles in the United States in the 50s and 60s. There's some good scholarship on how some of that was Cold War driven. There's people who politicians sitting on the fence decided to go over to the civil rights side because they thought this will help us in the Cold War. You know, it's an instrumentalization, but it worked in some sense. I wonder if you could say a bit about because some listeners may still not be completely familiar with I'll call it the modern liberal international order, which we associate with the post-World War II order that you have written a great deal about. I wonder if you could take 1 minute or so just to map out some of those features and what was in it for the United States. Why did the United States do this at the end of World War II? And also, do we still have this order? Do we have something else now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It comes back to the American era, the Pax Americana, the work that was done after World War II in creating this liberal world order, this U.S.-led order. And it is a kind of world system that was created. We see it more clearly looking back in the shadow of the Cold War, in the shadow of the 1930s, that was very much on the minds of the architects of this order. It was both the threat of the Red Army in one direction, but it was the 1930s from the past, seeking a world where we would not go back to that. We've just had a kind of extinction moment for liberal democracy, and there was this broad realization that we've got to we have to create a different kind of order. And this is a core argument in the book, and it brings us to FDR and this sense that, unlike Wilson saw liberal democracy kind of on the move. In 1920, all countries west of Russia had some kind of parliamentary system of one kind or another. In the 30s and 40s, when the next era of order building, the one we're looking at now, occurred, there were very few. We're down to a handful. And there was a real sense that, unlike the Wilson period, where liberal democracy would in some sense be the glue that would hold the international order together, in the time of FDR, it was the international order that would be the glue that would hold liberal democracies together. So there was an inversion of what liberal order was doing. It was doing much more work in securing the foundations of liberal democracy. That's an argument that, in writing my book, I came more and more to that view. And seeing more of a contrast between Wilson and FDR than most people see. But this notion of creating a container, a kind of ecosystem, I think you've used that term as well, a very, very kind of evocative way of looking at the environment in which these states need to be placed. And that environment would be more rule-based, more cooperative structures that would allow these liberal democracies to rebuild themselves after the war, to make good on the new promises that modern social democratic governments are making to their people. The kind of mobilization of society in a new kind of geopolitical environment, the Cold War, is asking more of governments to do things individually and together. So this order built around institutions of various sorts, economic, political, and security institutions, creating mechanisms for solving problems. And just a couple of those problems, John, that I'll mention to kind of make the case that there was this kind of brilliant, in some ways accidental, but brilliant reimagination of international order in the 40s and onward. And we are still living in that order, but we don't always appreciate what happened and why it was so profound. Creating a structure for, well, let's just make a list of Germany and Japan to be redefined as great powers and integrated into a common system, to find a way through NATO and the EC of France and Germany bearing their own old enmities and launched the European project, the creation of new mechanisms for managing interdependence. We call it Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, which later became the WTO. The kind of framework, kind of shadow of the American-led order allowed these societies, all of whom are making new types of social democratic reforms at home, the welfare state, the British national health system. The Germans are doing their own form of reinventing market society, the French, the Japanese. There's a kind of sort of quiet revolution in how liberal democracies are organized, and there is this framework for doing it. And then a couple more things. There's a kind of framework that the U.S.-led order provided in the ways I've just described it, that is a kind of welcome mat for other countries that are making transitions towards liberal democracy, more open rule-based order in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia. And then I would say, South Korea is a fantastic example of a country that moves from dictatorship to a vibrant liberal democracy. It would never have done so without this kind of framework, free world system that provides capacities for intergovernmental cooperation, security, markets, a kind of, to summarize, this order as a kind of mutual aid society for those that are in it to find ways to manage their economic systems and provide security, and through solidarity solve problems. So I've given it a kind of rosy portrait, shall I say? But I think one of the things that you need to do is to defend institutions that the historical records suggest work. Because despite the failures, there's something there that you don't want to see it escorted off the stage of history without people being fully cognizant of what it was and what it did, so that we are honest with the choices in front of us today.
Yeah, great. We have some questions starting to pile up, some of which are about defending the order. I wanted to ask one more question before we get to those, and it's implicit in what you said a moment ago. Among the tensions you identify in liberal internationalism is one between protecting democracy. And you have this striking metaphor. You say toward the end of the book, democracy, realism says states are like billiard balls. That's a common metaphor that realists use. You say they're more like eggs, and they need cartons. They need a carton to protect them. And so that's one aspect of liberal internationalism, a project to protect democracy. That's it. That's in your title. It's in the iconic. This is St. Paul's Cathedral in London during the war, during the Blitz, right? But another aspect that you also write about is liberalism's really impulse toward inclusiveness, openness, not clubbishness, not exclusivity. So how do you think about that? How do we think about that in today's world? I would say, because the Fukuyama end of history, it's the end of history back, and we have players out there who are not liberal democracies, and they're not interested in democracy for themselves, and so on.
Yeah, first of all, on that metaphor, I actually have a long footnote in my book where I go back and trace that metaphor back to John Vincent, a late great Irish scholar.
Sure.
In the English context, it was an egg box, not an egg carton, but the American scholar egg carton. And Dan Dudney uses it in a slightly different way. But that's, or I sometimes think of it as a kind of liberal democracies as orchids, and the international order that they're trying to create is like a greenhouse or a terrarium, so that they can have the right humidity and oxygen and all the rest to be all they can be. What you point to is this notion of both kind of inclusiveness and clubbishness. I think both are there. It's complicated because liberal internationalists have made both arguments. In this book, I've kind of come back to the club idea as being necessary because the wider world, there are many countries, increasingly Russia and China clearly, don't want to live in the same kind of elevated set of order with an elevated set of social purposes that we associate with that terranium or with that greenhouse or with that egg carton. So there's inevitably going to be some layering and some exclusion. And I do argue that with the rise of China in the 1990s and afterwards, what was kind of missing in that story, that welcoming story of trying to integrate China with the idea that they would move in the direction of these liberal democracies, more open, more rule-based, and so forth, that there was a lack of conditionality that was fully applied, that China got a lot of the benefits of trade, for example, without buying into that larger suite of purposes. So there is a virtue of the club logic because, like you see in the EU, it creates standards that states have to meet if they want to get the advantages of being on the inside. And in some ways, the struggle with Hungary today is to see if that logic of conditionality can be reapplied. And I do think that that's something that the Biden administration is trying to reestablish, a sense that let's get a working group of countries who are aligned in interests and values to drive the reform agenda, not to close the door to everybody else, but in fact, the more you would want at the end of the 21st century for China to be a partner, you want to have a coherent liberal order that they can either compete with and at some point perhaps decide to cooperate with and maybe even decide to throw their lot in with. So I think either way, whatever you think is going to happen in the 21st century, the default and necessary condition really is to reconstitute a working coalition. So the liberal order kind of has both logics, and indeed, it's there across the history. Just one little point: Woodrow Wilson. So Wilson, when he brought the U.S. into World War I, he made the case that there would be a post-war organization, a peace organization based on collective security, and everybody would be invited in. But then during the war itself, he said, no, it's going to have to be liberal democracies. They are the only ones that can behave in a way that's consistent with the vision of the League. And then after the Paris Peace Conference, he went back to the earlier view and to the more inclusive view. So one thinker, a particularly important one, argued it both ways. So it's out there, it's a debate, it's not settled. I kind of say you need both. You need to have some doors that are open, but you have to have turnstiles and tickets in some sense also to make it more consistent with the social purposes you're trying to preserve.
Yeah, and I think it's worth emphasizing something you emphasize, and many of us in the 90s thought, and I think the Clinton administration and the Bush administration held to some sort of theory, loose theory maybe, that if China gets in partway, the magic of the order will do its work, and history will end for China as well. And that was a long time ago. My students weren't around during that distant period, and it just seems like but it was a plausible. I think it was a plausible thesis at the time, and it's not so much anymore. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and I want to combine two of them that are more or less right on what you've just been saying. One's from Steve McLaughlin, He says, please comment on China's international influence in the 21st century and compare and contrast U.S. government responses to that under different administrations. Whose policies are better geared toward preserving national autonomy, free markets, human liberty, Biden or Trump or other past presidents? And just a moment, a question from Thomas Geisinger, more general. If you could suggest one specific policy change to make the US and the world safer for democracy, what would it be? So first is asking you to talk about recent administrations handling China, and the other is what's a policy change you would make to make the world safe for democracy?
Well, on the second question, I'll just say that I think the greatest danger to the liberal democratic world is happening at home. China and Russia are clearly do not wish liberal democracy well, or the liberal order, or Western liberalism, or the kind of progressive vision of open liberal societies, multicultural, and so forth. The kind of world that we celebrate in our institutions, our values, our creed, is something that is being contested by other great powers in a way we haven't seen for a long time. So we'll come back to that. But I do think I worry more about the internal workings of liberal democracy, our polarization, the kind of failure to make good on the kind of dream, the differences we have, the fact that our political parties, at least one of them, sees the other side as an enemy in many ways. The use of the term traitor and say if the other side wins, we all lose. The kind of absence of a sense that is essential for liberal democracy, and that is to reduce the returns to winning. That is to say, winning should be a winning party should have the ability to set the agenda, but not to do everything. So the losers don't think they lose everything, that they can rebuild and their coalitions and win the next election. So this notion that not everything is being contested is very much necessary for liberal democracies to survive. Just for political scientists, one of the most eloquent versions of that thesis I just gave you, Jan Elster, in one of his wonderful books, makes that case in a way that I use in my earlier book, After Victory, to make that logic clear. So getting back on track, getting past Trump. So I do think Trump is a outlier that has great dangers to our kind of liberal democratic frame. So getting past that kind of populist nationalism, the xenophobia, the kind of appeal to a kind of racialized politics. I think there's a lot here we can do. There's also a political economy component to rebuilding liberal democracy at home. Lots of people who were in the middle class are sinking below the middle class. So there's a huge amount of work to attend to the kind of almost Gilded Age inequality that we've returned to, and finding a way to regulate and redistribute and rebuild our societies. I think if we do that, then I don't worry as much about Russia and China.
Well, you anticipated another question. I just want to read part of the question from Juliana Cortinas. Democracies, which you've more or less anticipated, democracies seem to have been challenged from the inside. Some of the deepest roots of U.S. democracy, for example, have been challenged by internal groups and actors that seem to have somehow disregarded IR literature. He actually, let me put this question to you. Professor Cortinas is a political scientist from Brazil. Considering that these challenges have also affected international institutions and the idea of the USA as an example, how do you deal with these connections between levels of analysis and still create useful theories? That sounds like something you could answer you could spend about an hour on, but he's asking about levels of analysis and what you do with that. So,
well, one way to answer that is, and that's a great question, Professor. I guess what I would say is that the levels do interact. For example, I talk a little bit about this in the book. There is good social science that tells us that when the leading state in the system is a liberal hegemon, or the leading states, maybe as a coalition of great powers, are liberal democratic, it's more likely that the wider system will support transitions toward democracy. So in the late 19th century, after the World War II, the period of decolonization, and then after the Cold War, you get kind of states that internally, like the United States, are liberal democracy, embracing that tradition and using that to inform their international hegemonic behavior, extending trade preferences and security assistance to countries that are making these transitions. So the levels absolutely matter. And as I suggested, I think that's kind of the inside out aspect of it. There's also the outside in aspect. As I've suggested, the liberal democracies do need to have a congenial international environment to work in. And this is an insight as old as Immanuel Kant, that, as we were saying earlier, the kind of fragility of the internal workings of liberal democracy are such that in a anarchic dog-eat-dog world, those institutions are going to put it in jeopardy. And the kind of just final point that these liberal democracies are internally, by design, internally intention, liberty and equality. You can't have both at 100%. There's balancing and trade-offs, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence. Liberal democracies are designed to not have a stable equilibrium, to be a perpetual conversation, hopefully among people who share a kind of civic vision of the overall whole, to contest, debate, struggle, to make those balances and trade-offs. And you can't do that in a world turned upside down. You need to have that congenial environment. So I think outside in and inside out are both aspects or dynamics that are in play. You can see them across the centuries, and they are different layers and levels.
The world is endogenous, is something.
Indeed.
Here's a question from Matthew Frakes. I hope I'm pronouncing the surname correctly. Could you describe the differences between liberal internationalism and conservative internationalism? That's a phrase our colleague Henry Now at GW has used in a book, particularly with respect to historical examples from the 20th century. To rephrase it, is conservative internationalism a subset of liberal internationalism? Is it a different thing?
Yeah, I think on balance, let me just say that on both we might say the left and the right, there are kind of fuzzy boundaries. And you see this on the left with progressives after World War I. Were they socialists who were really throwing their lot in with the Communist International or working class movements that were kind of contesting the framework? Some were, and some were on the inside, but to the left. So there was a kind of ambiguous boundary. And then on the right, something similar. And neoconservatives, for example, would be a different kind of liberal. They would be liberal internationalists, I think, but there's a conversation as to who's in and who's out. So I know it's kind of a weasel response, but there's not agreement, so to speak. There's a conversation about who's in and who's out, and that's part of what it is. That's what makes it dynamic, I think. I think what Henry now has in mind is less of the kind of progressive aspects of the project to regulate and redistribute, whether it's at home or abroad. So more of that sort. He shares a little bit with the neoconservative view that the multilateral aspect of liberal internationalism, the rule of law, the international law, the multilateral institutional aspect, is less important than the preserve the values, defend the values, which get you, as the neoconservatives would say, to using force to protect or promote certain values. So that's a more conservative internationalism that is either inside the tent or not, depending on who you are talking to. But on balance, I think it's the it's the varieties that are emblematic of the tradition. So I think that's how I would say the different differences are kind of arrayed.
Yeah, and that is an ongoing conversation, debate. Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit unfair. Time is short. I'm going to give you two different questions, and you can choose which to answer. Because I can't. I think they're both great. One's from Josh Alley. When might the economic and political costs providing hard power to protect liberal order and democracy undermine democracy in the states providing that power? See, for example, military industrial complex in the United States. Question we often hear about hegemony, undermines democracy. And the other is a question from Bill Antholis, director of the Miller Center. He says, first, John, thanks for being with us. Given the complexity and differences internally among liberal democratic systems, are our leaders disadvantaged and outmatched by authoritarian actors? That is, authoritarian states are almost by definition driven by individuals seeking power. A great line from Game of Thrones: chaos is a pit, chaos is a ladder. Implicit in that, individuals see a lack of rules as the opportunity to gain power. So getting back to questions about the authoritarian power, do they have a built-in advantage over the democracies? Maybe those two questions are linked.
Yeah, they are linked actually, but I'll answer Bill's question partly by making the argument that liberal democracies are not disadvantaged. They're actually advantaged in terms of solidarity. I would definitely plant that flag and defend it. I think just in hearing Bill's question, I was thinking of Alexander Hamilton's argument in the Federalist Papers on why the colonies, each a kind of little mini democracy in its own way with their congresses and senates and so forth, should bind together in a constitutional system. And his argument was that if we don't come together, these colonies, and become a federal system, we will find ourselves at each other's throats, and that will undermine our liberal institutions inside of each of our colonies or states. So it was an argument that, in a different version of the thesis, Benjamin Franklin made, that if we don't hang together, we will surely hang separately. So I think there is more of a impulse towards solidarity among these states, because they need each other for fundamental existential reasons. That their own systems require a kind of critical mass. They believe today, as they have for 200 years, that they will be safer in a world in which liberal democracies hold sway. And of course, China contests that world, and therein lies the geopolitical rub. But liberal democracies, despite their many differences, and in a world of liberal democracy, not just a Western world, but a global world of democracy, think India and Brazil, and not just Western Europe and the Atlantic world, the differences are great, but that can be a source of great dynamism, learning from each other, and of course, cooperating, because if you don't cooperate, you will hang separately. And so I'm very eager to in the years ahead to look closely at the proposition I've just made, to see if it's true, to see whether the autocratic world, who do have reasons to also affiliate, have that kind of deep sense of hanging together. My bottom line would be, it's built more into the DNA of liberal democracy than these other states, to create a kind of larger space, milieu, ecosystem. And so I would argue that side of the proposition.
Well, we look forward to reading your conclusions and having you back to talk about those. Let me thank you, John Ikenberry, for joining us, for taking the time. And thank you even more for your important work, a very important body of scholarship for our time. So thank you.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been terrific.
Very good. We'll sign off. Thanks all.